Welcome back to Mystery Minds, the channel where we dive into the darkest corners of true crime, uncovering stories that shock, intrigue, and leave us questioning the world around us. In today's case, we expose the hidden world of organized crime, a tale of power, corruption, and greed that turns something as mundane as garbage collection into a billion-dollar racket. This is the story of the garbage kingpins, how the mob monopolized waste management. Stay with us as we uncover the rise and fall of a criminal empire hiding in plain sight. What if the garbage trucks rolling through your neighborhood weren't just collecting trash, but secrets? And what if those secrets tied your community to one of the most dangerous criminal organizations in history? This is the story of how a few men turned trash into treasure and how the dirty deals hidden beneath the surface finally came to light. In the 1970s, the city of Ironclad faced a crisis that most people couldn't ignore. The streets were buried under mountains of uncollected garbage. A sanitation workers' strike had paralyzed the system, leaving neighborhoods drowning in trash. Piles of rotting refuse lined the sidewalks, filling the air with a stench that symbolized the city's chaos. The city government, overwhelmed and underfunded, scrambled to find a solution. As weeks turned into months, residents grew desperate. Businesses were forced to shut their doors, and rats became an uninvited plague. The crisis became a headline issue, but for one man it was something else entirely, an opportunity. Vincent "Vinny the Fixer" Costello wasn't new to seizing opportunities where others saw chaos. Vinny wasn't your typical entrepreneur, he was a high-ranking member of the Romanelli crime family. Vinny had already built a reputation for turning problems into profitable ventures. Construction, loan sharking, and extortion were his usual trades, but this time he saw something bigger, a way to expand the family's influence and income under the guise of a public service. Garbage wasn't just garbage to Vinny, it was the perfect business. Privatizing waste collection became Vinny's grand plan. He knew the city was desperate, willing to hand over contracts to anyone who could promise efficiency. Through strategic bribes and a series of veiled threats, he secured a monopoly over Ironclad's waste management system. To the public, it seemed like salvation. Trucks began rolling down the streets, clearing away the mountains of trash almost overnight. Residents cheered as their city was cleaned up. What no one realized was that the Romanelli family had just taken control of one of the city's most essential services. Vinny's genius was in creating the illusion of competition. On paper, the city awarded contracts to several independent waste management companies. In reality, each of these companies was either owned outright by the Romanellis or controlled through intermediaries who owed their loyalty and lives to Vinny. Every garbage truck, every sanitation worker, and every route operated under the family's thumb. For the Romanellis, this new venture wasn't just lucrative, it was foolproof. Waste collection was a necessity. No one questioned the rising fees for garbage pickup or the sudden dominance of these new companies. The money flowed in steadily and invisibly, with millions of dollars funneled back into the family's accounts. But this was more than just a financial windfall. Controlling the city's waste also gave the Romanellis a new kind of power. Garbage was information. By sifting through what people threw away, they could uncover secrets, financial documents, shredded evidence, or anything else that might give them leverage over business rivals, politicians, or even law enforcement. This insight became another weapon in their arsenal, one that they wielded with precision. Ironclad's residents remained blissfully unaware of the growing criminal empire beneath their feet. The city's leaders, meanwhile, turned a blind eye, either too afraid or too complicit to interfere. The garbage crisis had been solved, and that was all that mattered. But as the Romanelli operation grew, so did its risks. Vinny's ambition didn't stop at Ironclad. He began expanding the family's waste management empire into neighboring cities and towns, using the same mix of bribes, threats, and takeovers. Competitors who refused to play along found their trucks sabotaged, their facilities burned to the ground, or in some cases themselves mysteriously disappearing. The Romanellis were no longer just fixing a local crisis, they were creating a criminal monopoly that spanned regions. Despite the outward success, cracks were beginning to form. The rapid expansion drew attention from people who weren't willing to look the other way. Independent garbage haulers started whispering about extortion, suspiciously high fees, and the sudden disappearance of competition. And while the public still believed their garbage was being taken care of by legitimate companies, A few people began to question the true cost of the Romanelli solution. What started as a plan to clean up ironclad streets had turned into a criminal empire hiding in plain sight. For years, the Romanellis had operated undisturbed, but the seeds of their downfall had already been sown, buried deep beneath the mountains of trash they had so carefully swept away. The Romanelli family's garbage empire ran like a well-oiled machine, and behind its success were two men who ensured the operation stayed airtight. Tony the Claw Russo and Frankie DeMarco were Vinnie Costello's trusted enforcers, each playing a vital role in the rise of the waste management monopoly. While the public saw garbage trucks and sanitation workers, these two were orchestrating a far more sinister operation from the shadows. Tony Russo earned his nickname for his iron grip on anyone who dared cross the Romanellis. A towering figure with a menacing reputation, Tony was the enforcer who handled problems swiftly and ruthlessly. His methods were brutal but effective. Rival garbage haulers who refused to fall in line often found themselves victims of mysterious accidents. Trucks were sabotaged, their tires slashed or engines destroyed. Warehouses caught fire in the dead of night, leaving competitors unable to continue operations. Those who persisted faced worse violent beatings or threats against their families. Tony's message was always clear: the Romanellis controlled the industry, and resistance was futile. Frankie DeMarco, on the other hand, was the operation's financial mastermind. Where Tony used fear, Frankie used numbers. A former accountant with a sharp mind for business, Frankie ensured that the Romanelli empire's financial dealings were virtually untouchable. He created a web of shell companies to funnel money through, making it nearly impossible for authorities to trace the millions flowing into the family's accounts. Frankie meticulously doctored records, making the Romanelli-controlled garbage companies appear legitimate and profitable. To the city officials and regulators who bothered to look, everything seemed above board. Together, Tony and Frankie were the backbone of the Romanelli waste monopoly. While Tony enforced compliance on the streets, Frankie ensured the books were clean enough to withstand scrutiny. Their partnership made the operation nearly impenetrable, and their loyalty to Vinnie Costello was absolute. Yet, their methods weren't without consequences. As the Romanelli empire expanded, so did the scale of their intimidation tactics. Independent haulers who once operated freely were now living in fear. Those who refused to pay the steep fees demanded by the Romanellis faced financial ruin or physical harm. Even those who complied knew they were walking a fine line, one misstep, and they could lose everything. The Romanelli family didn't just want a piece of the pie, they wanted the whole thing. In Ironclad and beyond, the Romanelli-controlled companies began using their garbage trucks for more than just waste collection. The trucks became tools for smuggling, transporting drugs, weapons, and other contraband under the guise of routine pickups. Garbage routes were carefully mapped to include stops that served as drop-off points for illegal goods. The Romanellis now had a dual revenue stream, one from their stranglehold on waste management and another from their expanding network of illicit operations. But the more they expanded, the more attention they drew. Police departments in neighboring cities began noticing patterns. Garbage companies with ties to Ironclad were muscling out local haulers at an alarming rate. Fires and accidents that plagued competitors seemed too frequent to be mere coincidence. Complaints of extortion from small business owners began to surface, though most were too afraid to come forward publicly. Within the Romanelli empire, cracks were also forming. Tony's violent tactics, while effective, left behind a trail of destruction that couldn't always be hidden. Frankie, meticulous as he was, grew anxious over the growing pile of secrets he had to conceal. The larger the operation became, the harder it was to keep everything under control. One incident in particular set off alarms within the organization. A rival hauler in a small town just outside Ironclad defied the Romanellis and refused to pay the demanded fees. True to form, Tony sent a message. The hauler's truck was found abandoned, its cab burned beyond recognition. What Tony hadn't planned for was the local authorities' reaction. The incident drew attention from state investigators, who began asking questions about the pattern of violence and arson surrounding the garbage industry. The Romanelli family had built an empire on fear and corruption, but the cracks were starting to show. As Tony and Frankie worked to maintain their grip, they failed to notice the mounting pressure from law enforcement and those who had grown tired of living under their rule. While they believed they were untouchable, forces were gathering that would soon threaten to dismantle the operation they had spent years perfecting. The Romanellis had risen to power by exploiting the shadows, but those shadows were now beginning to betray them. What they didn't know was that their empire was far more fragile than it appeared, and it was only a matter of time before the weight of their crimes would come crashing down. By the early 1980s, whispers of corruption in Ironclad's waste management industry had begun to reach those outside the Romanelli family's sphere of control. Small-town garbage haulers complained of exorbitant fees and unrelenting intimidation, but most were too frightened to go public. One man who refused to stay silent tipped off a young journalist named Clara Jennings, who had earned a reputation for pursuing stories no one else dared to touch. The tip seemed minor at first, just another case of alleged extortion. A garbage hauler from a neighboring town claimed he was being forced to pay outrageous fees to continue operating. If he didn't, his trucks would be targeted, his workers harassed, and his contracts pulled. Clara initially thought it sounded like a local dispute, but as she began investigating, the threads unraveled into something much bigger. Clara's first discovery came at a union meeting she attended undercover. There, she overheard hushed conversations about sabotage, arson, and unreported cash payment stories that all pointed back to the same source, the Romanelli-controlled garbage companies. Drivers and haulers shared stories of threats they'd received, trucks that mysteriously caught fire, and competitors who had vanished overnight. It wasn't just a case of business disputes, it was a system of organized fear. As Clara dug deeper, she began connecting dots that others had overlooked. She found records of companies that had gone bankrupt shortly after refusing Romanelli demands. She discovered that several of these businesses had reported suspicious incidents, fires, vandalism, or theft before their collapse. What struck her most was how systematic it all seemed. This wasn't random violence, it was part of a coordinated strategy to eliminate competition. The real breakthrough came when Clara managed to track down a man named Eddie Numbers Caruso, a former bookkeeper for one of the Romanelli-controlled companies. Eddie had fled the city years earlier and was living in hiding, haunted by the secrets he carried. After some convincing, Eddie agreed to talk, and what he revealed confirmed Clara's worst suspicions. Eddie provided her with detailed ledgers showing how the Romanellis funneled millions through a network of shell companies. He explained how the family created the illusion of competition, awarding city contracts to companies that all led back to the same source. He described bribes paid to city officials, intimidation tactics used against rivals, and the dual purpose of the garbage trucks, not just collecting waste but transporting drugs and weapons. Eddie's testimony painted a chilling picture of an empire built on corruption and fear. But Eddie warned Clara, digging deeper could put her life in danger. Clara now had a story that could shake the city to its core, but she also knew the risks. The Romanellis were powerful, and exposing their operation wouldn't come without consequences. Her fears were confirmed when she started receiving anonymous threats. Late one night, she found a garbage truck idling outside her home, its engine rumbling in the darkness. The message was clear. The Romanellis were watching. Despite the danger, Clara pressed on, compiling her evidence and preparing her expose. She contacted law enforcement, sharing her findings with federal agents who were already beginning to investigate the Romanelli family. The FBI, intrigued by her work, launched their own probe into the Romanelli empire. Agents began monitoring the family's activities, tapping phones, and planting undercover operatives in key positions. Clara's expose was finally published in the summer of 1983. The article detailed the Romanelli family's grip on Ironclad's waste management industry, their use of violence and intimidation, and their infiltration of city contracts. The revelation sent shockwaves through the city. For the first time, the public saw the dark truth behind the clean streets they had taken for granted. The Romanellis responded swiftly, using their influence to discredit Clara and her sources. They called the allegations baseless, accusing her of fabricating evidence. But the damage was done. The FBI had what they needed to intensify their investigation, and Clara's article had turned the spotlight on an empire that thrived in the shadows. The Romanellis had controlled Ironclad for years, but their carefully constructed empire was beginning to crumble. Clara's determination to expose the truth had set a chain of events in motion that could not be stopped. What had once seemed untouchable was now vulnerable, and the cracks in the Romanelli empire were growing wider by the day. Behind closed doors, the family scrambled to protect their empire, but the forces gathering against them were already too strong. The fall of the Romanellis had begun, and it was only a matter of time before their secrets would be laid bare for all to see. Clara Jennings's expose shook the foundations of Ironclad, but it was only the beginning. Her revelations brought federal attention to the Romanelli family's waste management empire, sparking one of the largest investigations into organized crime the city had ever seen. The FBI, armed with Clara's evidence, began to dismantle the operation piece by piece. The investigation was extensive, targeting not just the Romanelli family but also the network of enforcers, businesses, and corrupt officials who had enabled them to thrive for so long. One of the FBI's most effective strategies was infiltration. They placed an undercover agent, Michael Carter, inside a Romanelli-controlled garbage company. Posing as a new truck driver, Michael quickly gained access to the day-to-day workings of the empire. It was a dangerous assignment, but Michael was no stranger to high-stakes operations. He spent months earning the trust of his colleagues and superiors, carefully documenting every conversation, transaction, and shady practice he encountered. Michael discovered that the garbage trucks were indeed being used for far more than waste collection. On certain routes, hidden compartments in the trucks transported drugs, cash, and even weapons. Drivers were instructed to make discreet stops at warehouses, restaurants, and other locations where the illegal goods were dropped off. The routes were planned meticulously, ensuring that no one outside the operation would suspect a thing. Through wiretaps and surveillance, the FBI uncovered even more. Conversations between Tony Russo and his associates revealed the extent of the threats and violence used to maintain control. One recording captured Tony ordering the destruction of a rival's fleet of trucks, while another detailed payments to local politicians who had turned a blind eye to the Romanellis' illegal activities. These conversations provided irrefutable proof of the family's criminal enterprise. Meanwhile, Frankie DeMarco's carefully crafted financial network began to unravel. The FBI subpoenaed bank records, company filings, and tax returns, uncovering the layers of shell companies Frankie had created to launder money. As investigators followed the paper trail, they exposed millions of dollars in unreported income and illegal transactions. Frankie's web of deception, which had once seemed impenetrable, now became the operation's Achilles heel. The evidence was mounting, but the FBI needed more to bring the entire operation down. Michael Carter's undercover work provided the final piece of the puzzle. During one tense encounter, he was able to record a meeting between Tony Russo, Frankie DeMarco, and Vinny Costello. The three discussed their plans to expand into new territories, boasting about their control over the industry and laughing about the money they had stolen from the city. This meeting gave the FBI the direct link they needed to tie Vinny, Tony, and Frankie to the crimes. In the early hours of a cold November morning in 1985, the FBI launched a coordinated series of raids across Ironclad. Agents stormed Romanelli-owned businesses, warehouses, and homes, arresting dozens of individuals involved in the operation. Tony Russo was captured at his suburban mansion, where agents found weapons, cash, and incriminating documents hidden in a basement safe. Frankie DeMarco was arrested at his office, surrounded by ledgers and spreadsheets that would later become key evidence in court. Vinny Costello, the mastermind behind it all, was caught at one of his favorite restaurants. He had always believed himself untouchable, but as he was led away in handcuffs, it became clear that his empire had finally crumbled. The fallout was massive. News of the arrest dominated headlines, and the city of Ironclad was forced to confront the reality of how deeply corruption had infiltrated its systems. Public officials who had accepted bribes were implicated, leading to resignations and criminal charges. The garbage industry, once a quiet and unremarkable sector, was exposed as the centerpiece of a sprawling criminal enterprise. Despite the arrests, the Romanelli family's reach was not entirely severed. Some lower-level operatives managed to avoid capture, and whispers of revenge circulated in the underworld. For the FBI, the operation was a major victory, but they knew the fight against organized crime was far from over. The Romanellis had been dethroned, but their influence lingered like the lingering stench of the trash they once controlled. As the dust settled, the people of Ironclad were left to grapple with the knowledge that their city's cleanliness had come at an extraordinary cost. The empire that had risen from the city's garbage had finally fallen, but the scars it left behind would take years to heal. The question now was whether the city could rebuild itself without falling prey to another shadowy force waiting to take the Romanelli's place. The trial of the Romanelli family and their associates became one of the most sensational courtroom dramas in Ironclad's history. The courtroom was packed daily with reporters, legal experts, and curious residents eager to witness the unraveling of the empire that had dominated the city's waste management industry for over a decade. Prosecutors came prepared with mountains of evidence, audio recordings, financial records, and testimony from former insiders who had decided to cooperate with the government. One of the star witnesses was Eddie Numbers Caruso, the ex-bookkeeper who had initially tipped off journalist Clara Jennings. Under oath, Eddie provided chilling details about the financial underpinnings of the Romanelli operation. He described how millions of dollars had been laundered through shell companies and how every decision, every bribe, every act of violence was carefully calculated to maintain control and maximize profits. His testimony painted a damning picture of an organization that thrived on greed and fear. The undercover FBI agent, Michael Carter, also took the stand recounting his dangerous mission to infiltrate the Romanelli-controlled garbage companies. His testimony revealed the inner workings of the operation, including the dual-purpose garbage routes that transported drugs and weapons alongside trash. He described the constant tension of working undercover, knowing that one misstep could mean his death. Michael's recordings of meetings between Tony Russo, Frankie DeMarco, and Vinny Costello were played in court, leaving the jury and spectators in stunned silence. Clara Jennings, hailed as a hero, testified against the Romanelli family. Her bravery earned her rewards, but she continued to live in fear of retaliation. Tony Russo's violent tactics were brought into sharp focus as prosecutors presented evidence of arson, sabotage, and physical intimidation used against competitors. Witnesses, including small business owners and rival haulers, testified about the threats they had received and the fear that had driven many of them out of business. One powerful moment came when a rival hauler described finding his truck in flames after refusing to pay the Romanelli family's fees. The emotional testimony underscored the human cost of the Romanelli empire's stranglehold on the industry. Frankie DeMarco's role as the financial mastermind was equally damning. Prosecutors laid out the intricate web of shell companies he had created to hide illegal profits and secure city contracts under the guise of competition. Frankie's meticulous records, once his greatest asset, became his undoing. Every ledger, every falsified document, became irrefutable evidence of his involvement. At the center of it all was Vinny Costello, the architect of the entire operation. Prosecutors argued that Vinny's ambition and cunning had turned a garbage crisis into a criminal empire. They portrayed him as a man who thrived on manipulation, using bribes to secure contracts and violence to eliminate threats. Vinny's demeanor in court, calm, almost smug, only added to the prosecution's narrative of a man who believed himself untouchable. The defense tried to discredit witnesses and frame the operation as legitimate business practices misunderstood by outsiders. They painted Eddie Caruso and other cooperating witnesses as opportunists seeking leniency for their own crimes. But the sheer weight of evidence proved impossible to counter. Every claim the defense made was dismantled by recordings, documents, or first-hand accounts. After weeks of testimony and arguments, the jury deliberated for only 3 days before reaching a verdict. Vinny Costello, Tony Russo, Frankie DeMarco, and several other key players were found guilty on multiple charges, including racketeering, extortion, money laundering, and conspiracy. The sentences were harsh, with Vinny receiving life in prison without the possibility of parole. Tony and Frankie were sentenced to decades behind bars, effectively ending their reign of terror. The fallout from the trial extended far beyond the Romanelli family. Several city officials who had accepted bribes were also convicted, and new regulations were introduced to prevent similar corruption in the future. The waste management industry, once a tool of organized crime, was restructured under government oversight. For Clara Jennings, the trial was a vindication of her work. Her expose had set the wheels of justice in motion, and she became a celebrated journalist, credited with bringing down one of Ironclad's most dangerous criminal empires. But even as she moved on to other stories, the events she uncovered left a lasting impression on her and on the city she had fought to expose. Ironclad began the slow process of rebuilding its reputation and restoring trust in its institutions. The garbage trucks still rolled through the streets, but now they carried only what they were meant to waste, not secrets. The Romanelli Empire had fallen, but its legacy served as a cautionary tale of how power and greed could corrupt even the most mundane aspects of daily life. Despite the convictions, rumors persisted that not all of the Romanella's secrets had been uncovered. Some believed that hidden fortunes remained buried, waiting to be found. Others speculated that lower-ranking members of the family might someday attempt to rebuild. For now, though, the city was free from their grip. The streets of Ironclad were clean again, but the scars of its dark past remained a constant reminder of the price paid to reclaim them. But questions remained. How many other industries had the Romanelli family infiltrated? And could another criminal empire take their place? Even today, the story of the garbage kingpins serves as a grim reminder of how easily corruption can hide in the everyday routines of life. Thank you for watching this episode of Mystery Minds. If you enjoyed this story and want more true crime mysteries, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. And remember, the darkest truths are often hiding in plain sight. Until next time, stay curious and stay safe.